In general terms, whenever we talk about managing projects generally, we often talk about the traditional project management approach, which is the initiation, the planning, the organising, controlling and closing stages of a project. So when we manage a project, so for example, if I talk about that social day, we have an initiation part where we make a determination whether we do it or not. We get sign off on whether it's going to happen. And then once we decide that it's going to happen, we then start doing the thorough planning. So that's when we break down all the tasks and activities that need to be done. We think about the resources required. We start to then organise things by creating schedules and assigning resources. We then control the execution of those tasks that we've planned and organised. So as things happen, we keep an eye on things and see whether they're going as planned or not. And then eventually, when we've hopefully met all our targets, we close off the project. And if we look at some of the more specific programs such as Prince2 or the PMBOK ones, they work around that model, but they have their own unique approaches to it. Going through this qualification and using the resources that we'll be focusing a lot on the project management institution body of knowledge. So the PMBOK work is highly represented through these resources. So a lot of the stuff that we'll go through in this particular qualification will be about the initiating, the planning, the executing, the monitoring, the controlling and the closing. So very similar to traditional, but using process as a main driver within that. And if we talk about what are the accountabilities of a project manager, broadly speaking, a project manager should be responsible for initiating the sponsor specification. So the sponsor is the person who traditionally is the most senior manager responsible for that project. And I often refer to the sponsor as the person who signs the checks. So your boss comes to you and says, I need you to manage this particular project for me. I need you to manage this particular social day we're going to have. You then take those specifications, and they might say to you, it needs to be on this particular day, it needs to cost this particular much, and it needs to have these parameters. So it has to have family, it's not only staff, it's also family, it needs to be outdoors, and it needs to tie in with a particular theme. So they'll give you the specs. You then have to make sure that you define that clearly, get them to sign off on all the detail of what you've defined, which is what we call the scope. You then need to, once they sign that off, you then need to take that away, create your work plan from that. You need to then develop a risk management strategy. You need to manage contingencies as they occur. You then need to organise, coordinate your staff and deal with any issues as they arise, which always will have issues to deal with. You need to keep all the necessary stakeholders informed, keep them in the loop, and then of course if it has an impact on any of your customers or any other stakeholders, you need to keep dealing with those, and of course at the end you need to wrap up the project, hopefully, because it's been a successful outcome. And I've already made reference to some of these stakeholders, but if we refer to what a project stakeholder, a stakeholder fundamentally is anybody who has an interest in what's going on. So anybody who has a finger in the pie. And there are different levels of stakeholders. So you've got stakeholders who are highly engaged and highly influential and very important. And then you've got stakeholders who may not be as important and may not necessarily have the level of influence, but still need to be kept informed because they've got some level of interest. So stakeholders can be quite broad. The most common ones are your project sponsor, and as I said, that's the person who owns the idea, who has passed it on to you to manage. There's yourself as the project manager. You're responsible for delivering on the sponsor's specs. There's the project team who report to you and who you will assign to do various tasks to deliver on the project. And then of course you've got an array of other stakeholders, such as, for example, contractors, suppliers, customers or end users, and even considering things like government departments, whether they be at a federal level for things around legislation, or whether at the local level for things such as rule and govern. So those stakeholders can be quite varied, but fundamentally it's anybody who's got an interest in what's going on. when we talk about managing projects, we often talk about the phases of projects, and I've talked about some of these phases when I just briefly touched on different approaches to project management. The fundamental phases for a project are these: you initiate the project, and that's the initiating phase. You then, once you get sign off from your sponsor through the initiating phase, you do the planning phase where you set up work plans. You then do the organising phase, which is where you set up your schedules. You then do the controlling phase, where you monitor what's going on and make necessary adjustments where required, and then you close it off. So they're the standard 5 phases of a project. But also within the project, you have the life cycle of the project. So a project, just like any living, breathing organism, all go through life cycles. So the 4 cycles are concept, development, execution, and closure, and they're not evenly balanced. So each of those don't represent 25% of the period of time a project goes through. They're quite varied. So, for example, a concept, getting the sign off of an idea, doing the scope, and getting the key stakeholder to sign off on your budget, on your specs, and so forth, can be quite a lengthy process. Then going through doing a thorough planning and organising of the project can also be quite a lengthy process. The actual execution itself, if we talk about that social day, the execution might be just a week of time by the time that things start rolling onto site marquees and you do your cleanup at the end. The actual execution may just be a week, but you may have already spent months with the concept and development. So they're not necessarily going to balance up quite evenly. And the same for closure. The closure can be quite a short period as well by the time you do the consultation and do the report and get that through. So as a project manager, it's important to bear this in mind, because it's important to ensure that you provide enough planning and enough attention to the concept and development stage, because this is where you really set up your project for success or for failure. If you don't do so, the 5 Ps, prior planning prevents poor performance. If you don't spend sufficient time fleshing out the concept, getting the approvals, developing the appropriate plans, you really are going to be making it very difficult for yourself as the project progresses.